So my name is Matthew Lodge. I'm the moderator for this session. I'm just going to get the slides going here. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is the real-world cloud panel. So I work for VMware in the cloud services team. And let me introduce our distinguished set of panelists. Oh, sorry, I have to do a legal disclaimer first. Now I can introduce our distinguished panelists. So going across from right to left, I'm going to start with Drew Garner from Concur, Dr. Stuart Lee from the University of Oxford in the UK, Paul McNamara from Adobe, and Chris Spence from the National Democratic Institute. So the format for the panel is that I'm going to interview each of the gentlemen here. They're going to talk about what they're doing with cloud and hybrid cloud, talk about their experiences, what really drove them to choose the approach. What are the business drivers? What are they trying to do for their organizations? What mission are they trying to execute? And how does that translate into cloud? Why is that a good fit? What are they going to do in their own premises? What are they going to do with the service providers in public cloud? So without further ado, I'm going to start with Concur and with Drew. How many folks in the room actually use Concur? Okay, wow, okay. Good percentage. So integrated travel and expense management. So for those who haven't used Concur, I'm showing you the iPhone version of the application here, but this is basically a thing that makes your life so much easier in terms of entering your expenses if you're an employee of a company large or small. Drew, let's start with you. Talk to me a little bit about what you're currently doing. You're working with AT&T. And you're using a combination of hosting and on-premise and cloud. So tell me about that.
Right. So we have a private cloud that we've built over the last 3 years, working to virtualize it. We're about 80% virtualized. And in the last year, we've been working to move that to a hybrid cloud with AT&T and their compute as a service platform. So particularly in our DR environment, so that we could have that for our environment so that we could keep up with production, essentially.
So what goes in your private cloud? What's hosted and what's in public cloud?
So right now, sort of main production site is private, and the hybrid cloud scenario is just being used for DR at this point, but it's also going to be used for load testing and for some QA functionality for now, so that we can make sure that our automation and everything that we've built test case well, and then future plans to use it in production. Okay.
So you mentioned a little bit there about some of your use cases for that. So why that particular mix? What is it? You've already highly virtualized. So what is it about private cloud that makes a difference?
So being sort of an e-commerce provider and kind of being very business service related, we're very sort of seasonal in our traffic. End of year, people have to get their expense reports in, or there's certain travel deadlines and these things. So the hard part for us is that currently in our private cloud, we have to keep around just a lot of capacity for those days. There's certain hotspots during the year, during the week, and there's just a lot of unused capacity there that we really wanted to leverage a hybrid model for, so that we could have a lot less infrastructure on hand to do the same amount of work.
Okay. So one of the things that you told me about when we talked beforehand, you guys have had phenomenal growth. So talk about some of the things that are happening in the business that are really driving you.
Sure. Yeah, it's been really exciting, kind of the evolution of sort of the corporate spend user. And really it's for us in the past year, it's been around our platform as a service and enabling our API platform and people able to get data from our systems into their systems, into their portal, that stuff. But it's also been around mobile, and with our acquisition of TripIt and that platform, and integrating that into our mobile strategy, and really sort of empowering the business traveler.
Okay, and as I'm going through my notes here, so you process $50 billion of expense payments a year, is that right?
Yep, just a little over $50 billion right now.
And how many customers do you have, or clients?
There's, between all the platforms, there's about 16,000 clients.
Okay. So one of the things that we've heard from some of our customers about is they're worried that they're going to have to rewrite their application for the cloud.
Sure.
So how did you tackle that?
So we actually took a small seed cage, working with AT&T, and placed that into their cloud cage. So we could still sort of own the bits and pieces that we need to own to remain PCI compliant, SaaS compliant, and all the other audits that we have to maintain. And then we can burst out to them for things like web servers and business logic and these things that aren't really going to keep data. It's just handling data, from us to the data storage.
So talk to me about, you mentioned PCI. So you were compliant. So what is it about that it has to be physical? Can you elaborate on that?
There's just a lot of restrictions as to where data at rest sits, and where, even though there's a lot of things that we do with credit cards as far as encryption and hashing and use of salts and these things to make sure that it's not stored and clear anywhere. We take so many feeds from banks. Over 600 banks feed us data every day, and then we're partnered deeply with American Express and other credit card companies, so we take feeds from them as well. So all of that, just where that data flows, how it gets handled, how it gets processed, how we understand what people are spending and are able to suck that into expense reports, has to be handled really delicately.
Okay, so paraphrasing, it sounds like the ability that AT&T would let you put that next to.
Exactly.
Right, that was part of the advantage. Okay.
Yeah, and owning all those sensitive pieces still for us, because the database for us is still the most performance restrictive piece of our application architecture as well. So we had to make sure that was something that we knew, not something that we had to, like you said, recode for. Right. Because that's something we don't have the time to do right now. Okay.
So let's move on to that a little bit. So you mentioned your developers, and obviously, essentially, you're a software company. That's really what drives the value for your customers. So what's kind of the release pattern? What kind of development methodology are you using? How does this work?
Sure. So we're very much sort of a modified agile shop. We do monthly releases, and we have a sort of opt-in methodology for our clients where we release features either based off feedback, things that people want, or we have we roll to sort of extended pilots of new features. But every month there's essentially a bevy of bug fixes and new features that are released, especially now, obviously, in the platform and mobile space, as I stated earlier. So yeah,
lots of change. Yeah, lots of competition in the mobile space.
Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, so one of the sort of initiatives that going on that's sort of part of the cloud movement is this sort of move to DevOps, the notion that developers and operations teams work sort of hand in hand, side by side. So tell me about that. How do you handle that at Concur?
So we have what we call dedicated service management teams that are sort of deeply integrated with R&D, and they actually report into the same leadership structure as QA. And they're the ones that handle the actual setup and configuration and how healthy the application is in production. And then we have a separate sort of infrastructure hosting team that deals with all the underlying hardware, the storage, the virtualization tiers, the networking, all the pieces that it would take to make the engine run.
Right. Okay. All right. So how does that, so explain the interplay of that, that kind of DevOps approach and your service managers? How does that interplay with how you deployed in cloud? What's the connection between the two?
Sure. We're still developing that automation piece that will kind of be able to turn up and turn down what we're going to need in the cloud. That's something that we're still sort of working on. But the monthly release schedule and that stuff is really important for us to maintain. So what we're going to do, the plan is to essentially bring up the full capacity of the hybrid cloud for every month's release, update it with the same automation tools that we use today in the private cloud.
Right, so that the compatibility of the two is...
Exactly, is always,
right.
And we can actually use it for a training ground for new people that are learning how to do releases in an environment where they don't have to, because previously that training environment was QA labs, which is just not to scale, doesn't have the same feature and functionality and tool set. So it's difficult to train new people, by never able to touch anything. Okay.
So next question, I know we have our friends from AT&T in the audience, but I am going to ask you this. So why did you choose AT&T?
So we've been partnered with AT&T since I've been with Concur, 8-9 years now. And we already really like what they're doing from a global data center perspective. We're actually in a data center in Europe as well, a super center there as well. And what we love their network, we love their services, and I think it's really sort of the combined portfolio that we can add cloud services onto an existing contract where we know we have other leverage to enforce future SLAs and other things that we're going to need versus bringing another provider in and being a smaller fish in somebody's pool that that isn't necessarily we're going to have the ability to deliver what we're going to need.
And the data center in Europe, is that for performance reasons? Is it compliance? What's the reason for that?
So it was first opened as internal IT and QA labs for Europe, but we will be expanding into 2 sites in Europe in next fiscal year, this site being one of them. So,
okay.
So we're looking
So it's just growth in the business?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
And we'll be doing Asia sometime down the road as well, probably.
Okay. Well, great. Thank you, Drew. All right. So I'm going to move on to Stuart from the University of Oxford and get onto my introductory slide. So University of Oxford, the English-speaking world's oldest university, founded in the 11th century. 38 independent colleges. This was the thing I found interesting about Stuart. It's like nobody in the University of Oxford actually has to work with Stuart unless they really want to. 21,000 students, that's a tough role, right? So Stuart, tell me about what Oxford is doing. You're doing this very innovative database as a service. So what's that about?
Well, this came out of a research project we did a couple of years ago to look at how our humanities researchers are using IT. One of the things we noticed was, an obvious thing that they wanted to use databases, but they tended to be short-lived databases, project-funded databases on an individual server tucked away, and their knowledge of how to handle the data and make it sustainable over the long term was pretty limited. So we realized that what we had to do was offer some form of central service, and as you say, anything we offer at the center in Oxford is entirely voluntary whether people pick this up, so we have to offer a good service. So we developed the database as a service, and now as part of the Activate program, we're looking to sort of move that into the cloud environment.
Right, so the Activate program is where you're sort of taking that forward into a hybrid cloud.
Yeah, that's right. Activate, we've signed up with that, and it's proving very, very good. If anyone's considering it, I would strongly recommend you go out and investigate it further. And it's allowed to accelerate what we're trying to do. So we've got a private cloud built at Oxford, and we've got a public cloud. We're using the Colt cloud service over in Amsterdam. And we're demonstrating that the database as a service can run at Oxford itself and then out on the public cloud. But also this is part of a much wider UK initiative.
Yeah, so let's talk more about that. So you mentioned the humanities, having challenges with database. So tell me more about that. What's the problem, particularly in humanities research projects?
I think the problem, it was very interesting hearing the talks about data directory, which were announced at this conference. The problems are very similar. We have this database sprawl. We have the lack of control over the databases. Specifically with humanities also is that they want to access their data for a long period. In the sciences, in the medical sciences and the pure sciences, data tends to go out of its lifetime quite quickly. But in the humanities, they may be coming back to their data in 10, 20, 30, even 60 years' time. So they'll want to have long-term access to that. And simply put, the humanities faculties aren't capable of managing that data. So that's why we're...
So it's not just the fact that they have servers under the desk. It's just a skills gap.
There is a clear skills gap, and this is recognized in the UK and I think in other countries. So we're desperately trying to train our graduates on how they handle their data and preserve it long term. Okay.
So you mentioned this is part of a broader government initiative. And so what is that?
Yeah, it kind of was a bit of a perfect storm in the UK. Not only did we get some government funding to look at this, we also got some funding internally to build a new data center. So everything was coming together based on our 8 years of experience of virtualizing using VMware's platforms. But also the government, all the universities in the UK, bar one or two oddballs, are publicly funded. I should point that out. So we have to sort of adhere to the government regulations, but in return for taking the penny. And one of the things they're pushing across the public sector is shared services. They don't entirely understand what they mean by that, but they're pushing it. And a recent initiative, it was about £10 million they released, called the University Modernisation Fund, was to set up a public cloud within the academic community sector. So although we're building a private cloud at Oxford and moving and demonstrating our database as a service out on Colt, there will be a service in the UK for any university to go to, and it will be a brokerage service, and you will then get access to cloud services within the academic community sector.
Okay, so that's great. So you're doing both private and public cloud. So when would you use one versus the other? What's the difference?
Well, I think similar answers to what Drew was giving. The thing that we find about the private cloud is not only the agility is what we need to sort of get best use for our resources is the other thing. The concern we get from the academics is what's happening to their data. They don't want it to be spread out across the world. Partly that's to do with some of the data. I mean, I've mentioned the humanities, but this would be offered to all disciplines, is stuff which we legally can't allow outside the university. Also, there is an inherent suspicion amongst academics that someone's just going to steal the research and go off and get more funding based on all their hard work. So it really comes from that. And they trust the internal services of the university.
Okay, so it's not necessarily a technical issue. It's more of an issue of trust for the organization.
I think that would be the main driving issue, but there are technical issues, obviously, you have to overcome with this.
Okay. All right, so how do you envisage this going forward? You mentioned sharing this among the universities, working with Colt, using the public cloud. So how do you see that functioning in the future?
Well, with the database as a service, we'll be open sourcing that product, and that will be available for anyone to pick up. And as part of the program, we have to demonstrate that another university, probably be Southampton, can just put this on their VMware infrastructure. Beyond that, they haven't fully spec'd out how this is going to be. One can imagine almost a self-service portal that you and any university in the UK can just go to, and then you can demand the services which will come from the central service, EduServe, as they call it in the UK.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, you also mentioned long-term data retention, and saying that's a particular problem for humanities, very long-lived data. So I understand you're doing something with the Bodleian Library. Is that right?
That's right, yes. I mean, we're still struggling with this because whenever you talk about long-term data retention, people just think you make a snapshot, you put it on a server node somewhere, and that's it. As long as you can get to it in 10 years' time, that's fine. But what we have is the problem that people want to continually access the data. So many of these databases that the humanities academics and other academics create are providing research resources to the rest of the academic community. So you can't just turn it off and bundle it up and put it away somewhere. It has to be continually accessible. So we've got to solve both of those. And one of the things we're looking at is the Bodleian Library, which is our main university library, obviously has several hundred years' experience of retaining the intellectual property of the university. So understandably, they're looking at electronic material as well, because they're what we call a legal deposit library, like the Library of Congress. And they're having to tackle with legal deposit of electronic material. So the idea would be that when you get to the end, perhaps, of your project or during it, you could migrate your data to their service, and then it would be accessible in the long term, that people could go there and search it, but search across the rest of the university's data sets.
That's pretty interesting. So anything else that I didn't ask you about this? Other issues?
Well, I think the other thing which we're doing, as I mentioned just in the side, is we've built a new shared data center. And what we're trying to do in that is convince the colleges and the other departments to come on board and start using our shared infrastructure. So we'll be using infrastructure we'll be selling infrastructure as a service to these departments. And that's proving quite an interesting argument to place because you have to try and convince them not only will they get better functionality, but it will be more cost effective to come in and use this central service. And the issue we're facing there is that in departments and colleges, they're not fully aware of the TCO of running their own shadow data center. Right. And that's an educational issue which we're having to face.
Yeah, so that's often a challenge in cloud because you get some very low headline rates. Mm-hmm. That's not really the cost, and especially when you factor in operations.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, okay. What is it about having both, VMware on both the public and the private side? What does that do for you?
Sorry?
The fact that you have the same technology on both sides, on the private cloud and the public cloud. I mean, you mentioned some reasons why you might want to do it on the private cloud. What does the compatibility bring you?
The main thing it's done for us is we can get this done extremely quickly. As I said, 2003 we started using VMware platform, and we've created virtual machines since that time. And we've been doing VM for rent service across the university. And when the money was made available by the government, we were basically given a year to build a private cloud and a public cloud and demonstrate this. And the only way you can do that is to go with an established product like VMware.
Okay, great. All right, thank you, Stuart. And I'm going to move on to Paul McNamara, who's an entrepreneur in residence at Adobe. And so Paul, tell us about what's Adobe doing with cloud? How does it fit in with company strategy?
Well, so as many of you know, Adobe has been around for about 25 years. Many of you probably know us from Photoshop and Acrobat and our PDF format. But in recent years, Adobe's gotten very aggressive about moving into the SaaS space. Today, virtually every one of our product lines has a SaaS-based offering. Photoshop.com or Acrobat.com. We also have a Connect Web hosting product in the cloud. We've done a couple of important acquisitions recently. About a year ago, we acquired Omniture, which is a web analytics company, and they're currently doing 1 billion transactions a quarter. So it's a very, very large, high-volume analytics in the cloud. And so Adobe now, we find ourselves with a very sort of complex environment where we have traditional on-prem software that we design and ship, and we also have a big component of SaaS software that we design and ship. And with regard to the SaaS properties, then our challenge is how can we be the most efficient at delivering these various products to our customers? These days, customers expect absolute uptime out of cloud-based services. They expect absolute security. And so we really have been working hard to come up with ways that we can deliver those kind of capabilities in the most cost-effective ways.
Okay. So specifically, what have you been working on? I know you've been doing a new platform for your customers to use to develop new marketing applications, for example. So tell us about that, and what's the connection with that and hybrid cloud?
Adobe has actually a fairly large enterprise business. We have many of the Fortune 500 companies are our customers, starting probably with doing visual design using our creative tools. But more recently, we have a set of enterprise products that allow customers to deliver engaging online experiences to their customers. And what we found is that if you look at the first sort of generation of websites, it was all about serving static content. Then we moved to a period where we were serving dynamic content. Now what's happening is you're serving experiences to your web visitors. And those experiences may be things like video, real-time collaboration. They may be integration with social media. There's just a lot of sort of things that you need to do. So we recently announced the Adobe Digital Enterprise Platform, which are a set of technologies that allow customers to deliver websites with these very, very rich experiences. And as you can imagine, enterprises, in many cases, will deploy their websites into their own on-premise infrastructure. In some cases, they'll deploy them into private clouds, or in some cases, they're even deploying them into public clouds. So we need to have the capability to take our, what we call ADEP container, the application container where the website runs, and be able to deploy that in a variety of environments and do that consistently across every geography in the world. And that's a challenge doing it in the old way with traditional hosting. And so now the advent of some of the more modern cloud-based approaches is allowing us to really do that cost-effectively for the first time. So
you mentioned that business units at Adobe have sort of SaaS offerings. So what is it about this that, why is this not SaaS? It's a platform, right?
It's a platform in that it's configurable, and we expose APIs which allow people to program to it.
Okay.
Because imagine enterprises, they don't want templated websites, right? So obviously what they want is content management, experience management allows them maximum flexibility. Okay. So think of it more as a platform from that standpoint.
Okay. And this is something that they could deploy inside of their own four walls, right?
It is.
Okay.
It is.
So being able to deploy that internally, externally. So I know you've been working with a number of service providers. So tell us about, so who did you choose and what was the experience there?
Well, so we're coming from an environment where we have a large number of relationships with traditional hosting providers. As we moved into this new Adobe Digital Enterprise Platform, we wanted to have some consistency in terms of the relationships with those service providers. So today, we have a relationship with BlueLock, which is a vCloud service provider. And with approaches like vCloud, we can also have relationships with other service providers who are more geographically focused or maybe have different sets of capabilities. But there's a consistency across each of those data centers. And that's very important from our perspective. It prevents us from having to change the product every time we want to change the data center provider.
Right. So vCloud Data Center, BlueLock's a vCloud Data Center provider. Gives you that consistency that you're looking for. Okay. So I know that you had some experience. You'd tried this at a couple of you tried this at another cloud and then basically had to move from a proprietary API. Can you tell us a little bit about what was that experience like and what did you learn from that?
Well, so one of the things that we understand about our customers is, again, think of our customers, enterprise-class customers. They also have a complex set of relationships with a variety of service providers.
Right.
So a one-size-fits-all approach doesn't work in the enterprise. You can't go to an enterprise and say, you must use this particular cloud provider. So we needed to offer our customers a lot more flexibility. And so moving away from a proprietary API set is sort of one step in that strategy, because that, as more and more standards start to evolve and common approaches to API sets start to evolve, it benefits us because it gives us a larger universe of service providers now that we can deploy these solutions into.
So what's your take on and you mentioned cloud standards, what's your take on the current status there, and how do you see that evolving?
From my perspective, I remember, there's some of you who sort of will probably remember this also, the early days of Unix and what chaos that was, particularly from an ISV standpoint, is we'd create a product and we'd port it to quote-unquote Unix. What that really meant is we had to support 13 different flavors of Unix, and it was an absolute disaster, right? If the cloud, particularly private cloud, moves in the direction that now you have 10,000 different bespoke cloud implementations, it's impossible to ever deliver cost-effective solutions in that environment, right? So standards have to emerge. And whether those are de facto standards or formal standards, I don't know. But they have to emerge to allow us to have a more sort of sane way of thinking about deploying applications into the cloud.
Okay. All right. Any other thoughts for us? Other things that you think are relevant out of your experience so far?
Well, the way we're looking at the cloud in Adobe is we see it as a fundamentally new style of computing. If you go all the way back to the 70s when mainframe computing sort of predominated, then you saw the emergence of the PC, and the PC was a fundamentally different style of computing. And what was interesting was it wasn't mainframe applications that got ported over to the PC. It was this whole new sort of class of applications that emerged called personal productivity applications that drove the growth in the industry. We think a similar thing is going to happen in the cloud. So for us, the cloud is less about moving existing applications into the cloud, and it's more about how do we deliver radically different kinds of capabilities to our customers that leverage the unique capabilities of the cloud. So I think we're in for a pretty exciting ride over the next couple of years. I think the industry is going to see another big growth wave, another big innovation wave, and it's going to be driven by cloud computing. And so we're sort of very bullish on the whole trend.
Okay, so let's dig into that a little bit. So what's different about, you said radically different kinds of applications. So what's different about them?
Well, from a customer's perspective, the coupling between infrastructure and capability is way looser than it was in the past, right? So if you free customers from infrastructure constraints and you start to think about applications as being anytime, anywhere, any device kinds of applications that, let me give you a very specific example. So in our creative business, if someone's producing an ad that's going to go into a magazine, there's actually a workflow that there's a large number of sort of small companies that participate in the workflow. One company does color correcting, another company maybe does the visual design, someone does typography editing, right? And that team of companies needs to come together in this sort of ad hoc way to work on this one ad. Well, in the old style of computing, that was really difficult. What you would do is you would take files and you'd FTP them around to the different participants, right? As things start to move into the cloud, as the workflow starts to go into the cloud, it becomes a much more natural way for these various participants to interact. They can just join the workflow in this very ad hoc, natural kind of way. And it really transforms the way people are thinking about what they can do with computing.
Well, that's great. All right, thank you. I'm now going to move on to Chris Spence. Oh, sorry, I realize I am skipping through here. All right, so Chris works for the National Democratic Institute in Washington, D.C. So if your country has been run by a dictator and recently has now become democratic, then Chris can help you out with that. Mm-hmm. That's essentially what his organization does. So they help countries become democratic. So they've been working in more than 70 countries, so things like elections in Afghanistan, And you can see the sort of mission statement there. But you think about a country that's had a dictator for the last 30 years. You don't have political parties. Nobody's got membership. None of those systems exist. And that's really the mission of NDI. So Chris, tell us a little bit more about what's the role of cloud in NDA and NDI, and how are you taking that forward using that technology?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of ways to answer that, and the first and quick and easy way is for our DC operation and our 70 field offices. We've started our journey toward the cloud. We're just in the consolidation phase, and I'd love to come back in a couple of years and talk about a success there. But what we're really talking about today is a cloud project that we've been working on with VMware and BlueLock, in fact, which is a hosting. Basically, it's an application that we've put in place to address the problem that my team at NDI has had over the years, and that is when we're working with political parties or parliaments or civil society organizations, election monitoring groups, for example, around the world, and we're going from country to country, my team finds itself reinventing the wheel. We're solving the same problem over and over. We're building the same application. We're customizing it slightly for this country and that country. We're putting it into Arabic or into Spanish. And essentially what happened is my engineering team became so involved in reinventing the wheel that we weren't innovating any longer. And so what we had to do then was think about, as we were going through the last several years of identifying that problem, the cloud comes about and it revolutionizes the way we all are going to be using IT. And so what we decided to do at that point was visit our friends over at VMware, which is a relationship I've had with some VMware people for a long time, since the old days. We were talking about some of the older computing technologies. But we said, here's the problem. We've got a low infrastructure environment. In our environments, we're not necessarily worried about resource allocation and more efficient data centers and saving power. In fact, what we're worried about is the fact that there is no power.
Yes.
In a lot of cases. The internet penetration is growing, but very low in most of the countries where we work, or at least many. Mobile devices adoption has blossomed, and we're very excited about that. There's a lot of potential there. But the problem is smartphones are decades, at least a decade away in many of these places. So we're still talking about GSM and SMS and that kind of thing. And so how does the cloud work in support of democracy and human rights in an environment like that? And so basically what we've done is finally solved a little bit of the reusability problem. We've built templated applications that we can move from country to country. And then we partnered again with BlueLock and some folks from VMware to push that application into the cloud, create an appliance, clone it, and the idea now is that with 2 or 3 of our key applications in the cloud, rather than our engineering team having to build and rebuild a little lamp stacks, these are little Drupal lamp applications, rather than having to rebuild that application in the cloud every 10 times a year for an election monitoring group and 4 or 5 times a year for different parliaments, we can instead spin up basically our field staff, our people around the world can spin up an application, customize it, localize it, get the local languages, maybe put the right map on it, and spin it up without our engineering team having to get involved. And having solved that, basically my engineering team can then innovate and get back out and try to save the world and look for new ways for the democratic, for technology to help democracy in the cloud. And the problems we've already solved get pushed out to cloud technology. So that summarizes what we've been doing.
So I'd included, I've got a couple of screenshots. I think make it real for folks here. You can sort of see the kind of things,
Sure.
You mentioned like reusing. So I have the Burma election tracker. So what is this?
This, the Burma election tracker is one of our election monitoring tools that we use for essentially tracking election violations. In this case, Burma had an election last year, and it was difficult to work in Burma. In fact, NDI doesn't work in Burma, but there are a lot of human rights groups that do, that we have a relationship with. So the human rights observers went around and documented problems that they witnessed through, basically it was paper data collection, transferred the data to a tiled border operation where the data was all collated and shared with the world through this tool. Now, the reason that this was important is for us on a Drupal platform, we solved a few technical problems that we hadn't solved before, so SMS data collection and a few other mapping applications and things. So we created a nice stack, and then what we can now do is clone it, like we did for the next slide. If you want to pull that one up. This is Viva El Voto, which is the Nicaraguan elections that are happening next month, and the observers are already working on collecting data about election irregularities in the pre-election period, the violations going on now.
Right.
And they're using the same platform cloned. Obviously, we dressed it up because it's a public-facing website. And so we were able to clone the application, and our engineers didn't have to rebuild it from scratch.
So people can text in things like election violations, that kind of thing.
That's right. And this,
Wow.
this application allows actually untrained citizens. We usually use trained observers, and they do a methodical approach. This particular platform allows untrained citizens to report their observations around an election, text them in, or they can email them in or call them in on a phone line, and they get vetted and categorized and shared on a platform that does various kinds of visualizations, including the mapping, which is kind of the most prominent in that snapshot.
And so one thing I wanted to ask you about, because when we talked before, you mentioned sometimes you're subject to things like denial of service attacks. This is things like reporting election violations in Burma, not popular in some quarters.
Right. Absolutely. There's a whole area of opportunity around working in the more repressive environments, the authoritarian countries that repress human rights and political rights across the board, and they use technology to do it in fairly effective ways. So we've got to deal with working in those environments. Nicaragua was actually one of those environments, as was Burma, and we haven't yet sort of deployed the vShield technology. That's what we're looking at next in the next stage.
Okay.
But CDNs and DDoS and basically worrying about everything all the way down to man-in-the-middle type attacks are
Right.
things that we have to deal with or think about as we put these things up. The Burma site was attacked around the election, as were most. There are 3 or 4 key Burma election sites that were all targeted, and we learned a lot of lessons from that about how to protect websites. But now that we're in the Blue Lock cloud, we can go to the next level and start using vShield and other tools to help with some of those
Yeah, and
issues.
I think also the other point that came out to me was that it's a lot easier to do that in the cloud, right? It's a lot easier to defeat a DDoS attack in the cloud than it is to do it inside when you've got one internet link into your own location.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Well, exactly. We would never put an application like that in our own on-premise. They're all in the cloud somewhere, but not necessarily. But now we've got them in the Blue Lock cloud.
Right. Great. Okay. So one thing that's kind of striking me about this whole thing, we hear a lot about the cloud and cost savings. This doesn't seem to be about cost savings, or is it?
Well, in some ways it actually is. I mean, if you think about the people who pay in the international development community, which is where I work, the funders, the people who pay for the programs, are paying for software development along with all the other democratic activities that are going on in these programs. And we really see this as a huge cost savings from the perspective that these groups can spin up these applications without paying a software developer, either on my team or in the country, to build a little application like this. So basically it saves the funders money, and more of that money can be diverted to political party activities, training, and the kind of things that actually have a little bit more direct impact. So we see it as cost savings. For my team, it's an opportunity cost gain in the sense that if my engineers aren't creating simple lamp stacks like this to build the same application over and over,
right.
We're actually forward-looking and being able to innovate in other spaces, including in some of the tougher countries where we're looking at new cloud technologies for those hardened websites and some of those issues.
Okay. All right. So is there a hybrid cloud angle to all of this? You're talking about lots of applications running in the cloud today.
Yeah.
Does hybrid cloud play a role?
We at NDI are going to build a private cloud at some point in the next year or so. But all of our program work is largely outward facing.
Okay.
And so it's typically public oriented. This software as a service application that we're going to run, if we can push that out and kind of get a little marketplace environment working, that's probably going to be the extent to which we really get into sort of the public-facing stuff. We wouldn't bring any of that stuff in-house. Now, we will have a private, hybrid environment for NDI's global operations, and that's the next project we're going to be talking to you all about.
Okay. All right. Anything else that you want to add? Anything we didn't cover?
Oh, just a couple points. One would be that one application of this that we hadn't directly talked about in this sort of question so far was the idea that what we're going to also do is be able to take these VMs, these images, and drop them down onto laptops. A lot of times we need to set up these environments in a non-internet connected environment. Basically either the internet's not reliable, or for various reasons we need to set it up on a local PC or on a LAN. And so one of the other pieces of this that's worth mentioning is that we want to be able to take those images, download them, and run them on a workstation. And that's something that is critical. I think we'll end up doing that as much as we do cloud hosting and cloning in the cloud. And the last thing I would say is that cloud technology, the whole sort of phenomenon and the wave, I really do think that this is just the sort of first effort that NDI is taking toward figuring out what the cloud means for democracy, for democratic development, for protecting human rights. And I'm really trying to encourage everybody, both on the private sector side, but also in my international communities, to really think about how to best leverage these technologies in this sort of human rights and democracy space. And so I really do think that over the years we're going to see this being one of the early attempts at what could really be some interesting and phenomenal, I think, applications of cloud technology.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. Okay, so we've heard from 4 panelists. We've got 4 very different cloud stories here. So now it's your opportunity to ask questions. If you would like to ask a question, please use the microphone so that we can hear you. But what would you like to ask the panelists who've got a wealth of experience here? So if you can, thank you.
What is the common denominator of the cloud for the 4 panelists? Is that the VMware environment?
So in a VMware environment like this, then yes, the common denominator is the VMware environment. Absolutely. Actually, I'll pass that. That's the simple, the facetious answer. I'll pass it over to the folks on the panel. What did you hear coming out? Listening to each other there. Anything? Any particular points come at you? Yeah, Stuart.
Well, I thought some of the points made about the need to be agile, quickly deploy something, the need for security, those all rang bells with me. So there is certainly a common need there.
Absolutely. Other things?
The portability of the applications and the idea that we can move them around, whether it's cloning them in the cloud or moving them to the desktop or moving them into public-private clouds and that kind of thing is certainly a significant common denominator, I thought.
Yeah, and there's a lot of movement there. Yeah, sorry, Paul, you wanted to add something?
Oh, no, I was also struck, the commonality between what Stuart was saying and what Chris was saying is both of them are service providers now, right? And whereas before, particularly in Oxford, there's this very complex environment of distributed kind of administration going on. Now, through cloud technologies, that administration can be centralized, and you can focus just on delivering a capability out to the users. And I think that's really important. So now the users don't have to have such rich domain expertise in, how do I manage computers? They can focus just on sort of their business needs.
Yeah, very much. Thank you. That's a good question.
I've got a question about, I think you said the UK government was setting up sort of a cloud brokerage situation that sits on top. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you see. Is that something that Oxford is going to hook up into? Is that something where you see a lot of benefits from that, or is that sort of a big question mark? And also for the others, if they see an advantage to brokerage or how that fits into the hybrid models that you guys are dealing with right now?
Great, thank you.
Yes, we'll be part of that in the sense that we may be able to sort of sell on our resources as part of that brokerage service. So if people come to the central, if you can imagine the service is almost like a cloud director, it's saying, well, you can have some resource here and you might be able to have some resource in Oxford. And I think because of one of the other common denominators is the financial pressures that all the universities are facing, certainly in the UK. Smaller universities may not be able to put this infrastructure in, but they want to take advantage of it. So hopefully we'll be able to sort of support them as well.
So is the role of broker in your situation, is that connecting the producers and consumers? Or is it a directory? What's the value add from the brokerage?
It hasn't been fully sorted out yet because it's still in pre-production, but I think the idea would be that relationship, production and consumers. Okay. So other thoughts, the second part of the question? What's about the role of brokerage in general?
Sure. I think brokerage for us is sort of enabling pieces of our application or the data that we hold into other people's applications. So it's more integration, I guess you would say. And really, we want people to be able to get features and functionality that we've built that are market leading, and they don't know they're using it essentially. It's just a piece of something else via our platform and our APIs. So it's slightly different, I think, in the SaaS world for us at least.
Okay. Paul, I'm going to ask you on any thoughts on that. You've been looking at cloud standards and it seems like brokerage ought to fit with that. If there are more standards, then a broker should be able to do more. Any particular thoughts?
Yeah, I think there's also a lot of complexity that we're seeing today, particularly with the orchestration of heterogeneous services, and the movement towards applications being consumers of heterogeneous services, right? So I think I think standards are emerging, but they're nowhere near where they have to be to really sort of achieve the end goal of being able to just let a particular application subscribe quickly to a service and get the resources that it needs. I mean, we're moving in that direction, but to me, we still have a lot of ground to cover.
Okay. All right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
My question is to all four panelists. Two questions, actually, so I wouldn't have to come back. First is, what do you look for in service providers? So you told us that you work with Blue Code, one is Colt, another one Blue Log. So what do you look for? Is it just a technology stack, or is there something else you're looking for as well? And the second question is, what are your challenges with a hybrid cloud model that you are bringing up in your environment? Coming where I come from, one of the challenges is bandwidth, but is there something else that you have as well?
Okay. Who wants to go? Paul? You go first?
So there's a real sea change happening in terms of sort of traditional hosting providers giving way to cloud providers. So in the old world, we'd have a relationship with a hosting provider. And if we wanted to change the environment, add capacity, we'd call them. And next thing you know, some sales guy would be parachuting in, and we'd be having some conversation about, 6 weeks from now, they could get a new server up and right. That now is all giving way to these sort of lights out approaches in the cloud, where now I'm interacting with a deployment API, as an example, and I'm provisioning my own capacity. And I'm doing that in an automated way. So the first thing that we're looking for today is that class of cloud provider, right? We really want to be doing this administration using automated tools and calling APIs rather than calling sales guys, right? So that's number one. And then beyond that, of course, and this goes a little bit to the standards argument, is today, particularly with our enterprise class customers, when we're selling a cloud-based service, the enterprise class customer still wants to understand a lot about the environment, what's security, all the sort of certifications, things like that. The effect of that is it tends to extend the sales cycles a lot for us. And from the customer's perspective, it's really expensive to buy things from us, if you think about it, because they've got these security audits that you're doing. So if we can get to a point now where we have some level of standardization in clouds where it just becomes a checkbox for a customer. They say, oh yeah, that's this kind of service provider, and I've already certified that kind of service provider in a general kind of sense. I think everybody benefits from that.
Okay. Stuart, was there something you wanted to add there?
I think I would agree with everything said there. I mean, one of the reasons we've gone with Colt is the functionality, the technical capability, but also the relationship they already had with VMware. And because we're on the Activate program, we had to move fast. We wanted to go with someone that was a trusted partner. Your second question was about the technical issue or the issues we're seeing in terms of the hybrid. I'll point out apart from the obvious thing about security, bandwidth is a concern, although we tend to have a pretty good bandwidth system or a network system in the UK. It's simple technical things, such as when you build a VM and suddenly move it to another cloud, it kind of gets a bit lost in the network range. So I think the announcement about, was it VXLAN, was quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Chris, I mean, you probably have the most experience with limited bandwidth countries. And anything to add?
Yeah, well, we haven't had to select a cloud provider yet. So that's I'm actually learning a bit from that conversation. But working in the low bandwidth environments, we have recently, with our field offices, pushed our mail and those kind of things into the cloud, largely because of performance. It's kind of counterintuitive that in low bandwidth environments, cloud mail versus Outlook on the desktop would actually be better. But we've recognized that popping your mail or hopefully not popping your mail, but moving your mail from DC to Monrovia is not necessarily an efficient thing to do, and putting it into in our case it was a Google Cloud, has significantly helped, with bandwidth in that context. We haven't yet had to deal with the hybrid cloud issues. I'm also learning on that. I do think that we're going to need to figure out, even with our DR strategy, which is going to be a hybrid environment with, I suppose, performance isn't such a big issue. But obviously, those are. I'd say I'm learning on that front. Looking forward to our deployment.
Drew?
For our service providers, it was really strength of vision was number one, how far in they made the investment and how they were going to scale, because we really wanted to be able to grow into that and know that there was a bigger, that we wouldn't be sort of the top customer, even though that we generate a lot of, over 1 billion web page views a month, and we generate a lot of traffic to our sites. We didn't want someone to be cutting their teeth in our environment.
Right.
So we went to Gartner and Forrester, and we talked, we kind of surveyed the market, and then existing relationship obviously was important.
Yeah.
As far as the challenges for hybrid cloud, it was really, there's two things. The first is really just making sure that we can leverage everything that we've built over the past 3 years with VMware and our private cloud and leverage that in a hybrid model, because there's so many tools that we've built and leveraged on and APIs and things that just have to be ported. We don't want to have to reinvent or bring in a new set of vendors or tools that won't coexist. And then the second thing has been, you don't really know, I guess, the underlying hardware where your VM is running. We want to make sure that that is up to scale for our performance needs and these things, because we have our TripIt product that we acquired is fully cloud, has been run on a cloud since its inception, and we're actually moving them into our data centers because they have a lot of issues with their public cloud provider that continues to sort of vMotion and move their stuff around to machines that, unknowns to them, don't have the same performance profile as other things.
Interesting.
So they've had a lot of issues with SLAs and service providers. I mean, it's a smaller cloud provider, but it's...
Okay, so size was really important. I mean, the size of your business.
Yeah.
You've got to have a lot of capacity, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's a great question. Thank you. More questions? Yes.
A number of you have experience with kind of traditional hosting providers and have moved into more cloud hosting providers. As you move into the cloud, things get a lot more dynamic with elasticity and stuff in terms of cost, and the cost is less predictable. Can you talk a little bit about how you've kind of talked with your finance guys around any of those problems? I've seen other people get a lot of pushback, not that it's more expensive, but that it's not predictable, right? That it's not something that the CFO can quarter by quarter say how much it is.
So Drew, you want to take that one? I'm sure you probably spend quite a lot. So
yeah, I've actually we've done probably 20 to 30 cost models on both worst case, middle of the road, and scenarios. It's one of the reasons that we did it in DR first, because we can exist and do performance load-based testing and other things to understand what the run rates would be, because we have all sorts of usage-based rates, but we've gotten actually burned in the private cloud side of things before with things like bandwidth or telco minutes for faxing people's receipts and these things. I mean, we do almost 2 million minutes a month of just people faxing in stuff to us. So we know the usage game. It's just trying to understand that in the compute world and trying to say that paradigm is now shifted. We have to understand, which generally we do with a high-low cost model, and then we try to stick somewhere in the middle with our finance guys to say this is our best certainty case of what it's going to cost us.
And I think also for you, and this, I've heard this from other customers, is that relating it back to the business you're in, it's like a cost of service.
Exactly.
And so rather than thinking about it as a fixed budget item, cost of doing business, cost of service, or cost of goods is easier for finance people to understand.
Yeah, our president can't wait for us to basically get out of DR and use this in production, because cost of service to sale to them is so much easier to equate, because every single expense report, obviously we make a fixed amount of revenue. So if you can equate that to cost from a cloud provider, so on a busy Monday we only burn X versus a slow Friday we burn Y, is fantastic versus keeping around an additional $3.5 million worth of hardware idle most of the time.
Right. Any additional comments?
Let me separate how we get paid by our customer from how we pay the service provider. So we're hearing from our customers that they want fixed and determinable kinds of pricing, right? Because for that very reason, it's like cell phones from 10 years ago. You get the bills like, how could it be $600? I just don't get it, right? So they don't want those kinds of surprises. So we've been trying to deliver pricing models that allow them to have fixed and determinable ranges. But then that creates a problem for us because on the back end, we're paying hosting cloud providers on more of a utility basis. And so it's leading us into these very strange worlds of probabilistic models and things where we're saying, well, here's what we think. The law of large numbers, we think here's what the workflow is going to the workload across all these customers is going to look like. And based on that, we're predicting our cost model, and it's getting all very, very complex. So I don't have a nice, easy answer for you, except to say I feel your pain, as Bill would say, because we suffer through that as well. Okay.
All right, we've got time for one more question. Yes. Oh,
let's go back to your model. API. Each cloud provider have different sets of API, and with your legacy database and application, you have to convert or meet that kind of cloud provider's API. Couple questions. How do you address single vendor relationship? What if the vendor go bankrupt? Trust, I mentioned trust already. And then the second question is, being industry body, do we have a reference architecture for cloud computing in the work?
All right. So I'll actually take the last part of that first. So from a VMware perspective, we do have a reference architecture.
Oh, not VMware.
Yeah. So, and that's what the cloud providers have built out, and one of the reasons that they have a common API, the vCloud API. So that solves some of your first part of your question, but I'll open it up to the other guys as well.
Yeah, just from our perspective, okay, so let me give you a sense for the complexity that we deal with. We try to automate our book-to-bill process. So in other words, a customer gives us a new order we want that to automatically flow through our accounting system and deploy an instance for that customer, as an example, right? If we're having to deal with all these different API sets, it's impossible. So that's why my earlier comments on standards is we have to get to a point where we've got some common standard approaches to particularly deployment APIs so that we can build our automation once and not have to fiddle with it if we want to move to a different service provider. And so in some ways, I think vCloud is going down that direction, and we think that's the right direction. I think probably we're going to see also open source standards start to emerge. And my sense is de facto standards like that tend to take root faster than standards bodies. So I think over the next couple of years, we're going to see the evolution of standards, and it's going to make a much more, sort of sane world for all of us.
Any final comments? No? Okay. All right, well, thank you all very much. We're out of time. On the way out, feel free to stop by our folks over there. You get yourself a, what is it? Veni Vidi Vici vCloud t-shirt. And maybe we'll even give you our cloud USB stick over there. So have fun. Thanks.